It's really gratifying to see the turnout tonight. Glad you're all here and that everyone's here to think about housing and housing justice and housing as a human right here in Los Angeles. Something that everyone in this room has struggled with in some way or another, because that's what unites us as Angelenos, is our traffic and our high cost of housing. Probably the second more than the first these days, since we do have some transit. I'm just here to welcome you and to thank the University of Toronto and Karen Kubey for involving UCLA in this very massive project of thinking about housing as a human right. We spent part of the day today talking about that in a, thanks, in a smaller group, and much of that will be here to share. I'll introduce the speakers in a minute, but I also just want to say thank you to Dean Lionel Popkin. Those that raise your hand. Many of us here in architecture are beholden to Lionel for keeping our whole universe together, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. So I'd like to introduce Karen Kubey, who's an assistant professor in architecture up at University of Toronto and who has really laid groundwork in the thinking about housing and urbanism. Many of you have read Karen's essays. I'm not the only one who assigns them, but I often do. Thinking about housing as more than just a place to live, but as a way of building cities and building equity in cities. So thank you, Karen. I'll hand it over to you, and then you're going to hand it back to me. Okay.
Thank you very much, Dana. It's an honor to be back in my home state of California, hosted by UCLA, and to collaborate with the amazing Dana Cuff and her team at cityLAB. So thank you very much to our hosts and collaborators and the amazing events team working behind the scenes. Very, very hard to make this happen. So the starting point for everything we're talking about tonight is that housing is a human right. This is not just a slogan. This has been codified in international law the US signed onto since 1948. And, you know, this is codified through 7 aspects: security of tenure, availability of services, habitability, accessibility, location, and cultural adequacy. So it's not just enough to have any kind of shelter, to have any kind of house. The right to housing means these things in international law. So the argument that we're making through tonight and a larger series is that it's not enough to think of the right to housing as a legal and economic and political problem. Of course it is those things. And we believe that the right to housing is architectural. If we look at these ideas of accessibility, cultural adequacy, et cetera, it doesn't matter how beautiful the policy is. This is going to be made manifest for residents through architecture. So we're inspired by work, historical work, current work, speculative work that's already happening to help to make the right to housing a reality for residents. And we hope to catalyze further work in that regard to bring architecture more into the conversation. We believe that this is an issue of spatial justice, or a term coined by Ed Soja that talks about how social justice manifests in the built environment, a topic that has gotten a lot of really important, necessary attention lately, including through Dana Cuff's amazing recent book. So we have 2 short and very complicated questions to ground our discussion tonight. One is what does the right to housing mean in practice? What would it really look like in Los Angeles? And the other is how can architects or other urban professionals contribute? And there was a slight rephrasing suggested, perhaps it's what can architecture contribute? So Dana mentioned who I am. So I'm Karen Kubey. I'm a Californian, but coming now from Toronto. And the work you're seeing tonight extends from a book I put out a few years ago, Architecture as Intervention. I'm also pleased to be with her with my colleague, Cassandra Santaguida from Toronto. We're part of the new Architecture and Housing Justice Lab there. And this also comes out of my work with the American Institute of Architects. So the book was a collection of 17 essays, including from around the world, including an amazing one that I highly recommend from UCLA's own Dana Cuff. And, this is interesting for perhaps for architects in the room. The American Institute of Architects in 2017 declared housing a fundamental right. And so with the Right to Housing Working Group, which is part of the overall national housing community development knowledge community, we've been thinking, in public through free webinars about what that means and, what's the role of architecture. So welcome to, you're part of something even bigger. We're glad to see so many people in this room, but you're part of something even bigger than tonight. This is a series we started in Mexico City with a roundtable there. So in each city, we're partnering with a local partner, just like we're partnering with cityLAB and Dana Cuff here, and convening both a private roundtable and a public lecture. So Mexico is a really fascinating context. They've had the right to housing since 1917, won through the revolution, and now 70% of housing there is auto-constructed. So really interesting, important question about the role of architecture in that context. In Canada, it's a really interesting moment. Canada got the right to housing in 2019. So this is very new. A lot of lawsuits are flying around trying to figure out what this really means. So it's a moment to shape what it really means and to introduce architecture into the equation. So here are our public talk for that, brought together Leilani Farha, former UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Housing, with international housing architect Paul Karakusevich. It was amazing. Then this North American summer, we were down in South America, first in Argentina, which is, as you know, going through economic and political upheaval yet again in that country. And so a lot of things are, their version of HUD, Procrear, no longer exists under the new administration. So a lot is changing, a lot is very difficult, and some amazing interventions, especially with cooperatives that have the potential to scale up. Then we went to São Paulo. And there were many things that were exciting there. One is that when Lula was president the first time, he instituted scholarships that allowed young people from favelas to study architecture. So that means now there is a generation of architects who grew up in favelas and are doing work in that context. So with our partner, we brought them to the table. Also in the image, second from the right, is Carmen Silva, head of the Downtown Homelessness Movement, or MSTC. So really amazing work happening in Brazil. 10 days ago, we were in New York. New York is as depressed as you might be about the state of affairs in the country, and energized, knock on wood, by a potential new mayor. We were lucky to have Zoran Mamdani's right-hand housing advisor at the table with us. So learning from architects there, that was in collaboration with the Housing Justice Lab at Parsons. And then just today, just in this room at a slightly larger table than we see here, we had a private roundtable convened by Dana and Manos and myself, bringing together, as you can see, some really brilliant people in LA doing work on the ground, architects, people working in policy, people working in legal ways. It was really an amazing conversation. These are meant to be catalytic. So the idea is, and I think this worked, the idea is that people are encountering new ideas, new people, and then bringing that into the important work they're doing every day. And I should say, yeah, so these are some of the questions that we looked at today and that will extend in tonight's conversation. And so here we are, 6 of 6 in the series. This is funded by the Canadian government. We're very grateful for their support, and by the Irving Grossman Fund. And the first one was funded by the School of Cities. And so don't worry if you weren't here at the roundtable today, because there will be a short essay with highlights on each of the conversations published in our media partners, Untapped. It'll be in print and free, no paywall online. And I mentioned our Housing Justice Lab. You can also check that out to see who's all been involved, to check out the videos of previous lectures, etc. And now I will turn it, as promised, back to Dana.
If there's anyone who, oh, maybe you guys, anyone who wants to come forward, there's a bunch of seats up here and you could do that while I'm talking. Travis, you'd have to scoot them forward, I'm sure. It's pretty exciting to see that the kind of work we do in architecture is so deeply tied to something like a human right and a civil rights movement. And I think this is one of the instances where we can really connect in architecture and in planning to thinking through these larger structures in which our work is situated and how the work we do might implicate some of those larger structures. I think, as many of you know, that was sort of the starting point in cityLAB in thinking about housing, housing justice, policy work, which many of you are involved with. I feel like it's a particular honor for me tonight to introduce our two speakers who represent the complexities and the excellence that's needed to really think about housing in a comprehensive and sophisticated manner. The first person is Ananya Roy. Dr. Ananya Roy teaches right here on our campus, and yet we in Perloff don't get many opportunities to hear Ananya speak, which is really a gift tonight. Ananya is the founding director of the UCLA Luskin Institute on Inequality and Democracy at UCLA. For as long as we're allowed to say the word inequality, I think that will remain true. She is professor of urban planning, social welfare, and geography, as well as being the Meyer and Renee Luskin Chair in Inequality and Democracy at UCLA. Ananya's had as one of her goals turning the university inside out in many ways. She works to bring social movement, allyship, and activism into the university, and really has been the catalyst for some of the most important work in that regard here. She started something called the Activist in Residence program, which we've been very fortunate to be a part of, which has been an influential piece of thinking about lived experience expertise outside of standard academic practices. And yet what might seem controversial or contradictory is that Ananya is first and foremost a scholar. She's a scholar of post-coloniality, of racial capitalism, of housing justice. And we will hear some of that spectrum tonight in some 20-minute capsule of this really broad and important work that Ananya undertakes. She'll speak first, but I'm going to introduce our colleague and former teacher here at UCLA, Julie Eizenberg, who's probably one of a handful of housing architects nationwide, really, that sets standards for how we architects participate in the larger context of housing provision. As we all know, it's housing production along with other issues of preservation and maintenance of public interest that we can have some real role in. And Julie's the model for that. She's the founding partner of Koning Eizenberg Architecture with her partner, Hank Koning. it's her generous attitude towards the people who live in housing, I would say, that really is one of the premier characteristics of the work that we see of hers. Around Los Angeles in particular, we have an array of Koning Eizenberg architects housing here. So her thoughts about not only individual residents, but about the public spaces that we share and the public infrastructure that's part of that have changed my thinking for sure. But I think all of us, if we look at it closely, we see paradigmatic models in Julie and Hank's work. They've won a zillion awards. Their firm has won awards, their projects win awards, and all very much well-earned. They also have several monographs, but I think we'll hear some overview also of Koning Eizenberg's work in Julie's 20-minute talk. After that, we will have a panel discussion with the four of us and invite the audience to also ask questions and engage in the conversation. So with that, Ananya, please come up, and yes, I still keep my microphone.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Karen. And thank you all for being here this evening. All right. My talk this evening is titled Beyond the Right to Housing, and it's organized around two provocations. The first is titled House of Gunther. I live in a neighborhood in Los Angeles where old homes rub up against developer houses. The house next to us is on the rental market for $24,000 a month, but usually lies vacant except for the occasional illegal Airbnb rental. The owner has several of these vacant houses scattered through the neighborhood, but himself lives in Beverly Hills. In addition to these hoarded properties, there are vacant lots, overgrown and rat-ridden, where unhoused neighbors often seek refuge. Last week, new tenants moved into the house next door. From my kitchen sink, I can see into their dining room and was puzzled by a huge neon sign that said House of Gunther. When we looked up Gunther, we found out that he is billed as the world's richest dog, supposedly inheriting $500 million from his German countess owner, who had lost her son, also called Gunther, to suicide. Previously, Gunther the dog had purchased and lived in Madonna's mansion in Miami and went on to buy soccer teams and much more. The LA House of Gunther will follow in the heels of a Netflix docuseries on Gunther's millions and will be a content house for Gunther and a bevy of influencers. Carla Orendorff, community organizer and my research comrade at the UCLA Luskin Institute on Inequality and Democracy, asked me, should we appeal to Gunther to solve homelessness in LA? You might think that this is a story about the absurdity of wealth, but the parody deepens. It turns out that an Italian pharmaceutical millionaire faked the story about a dog inheriting millions in order to promote luxury real estate and lifestyle branding, and most of all, in the millionaire's own words, as I quote, a financial artifice for taxes. There is no Gunther, but there is a Gunther Corporation and a House of Gunther. This story is intended as a parable about property speculation and the reproduction of wealth. And most of all, about this question, to whom do things belong, that I see as an important anchor for a discussion of the right to housing. This question comes from an article written several decades ago by urban planning scholar Donald Krukerberg, And he argued that while urban planning, my field and profession, is concerned with where things belong, the more important question is to whom do things belong? I was asked today to speak primarily to architecture students who might be pondering their role in the right to housing. And so let me say this to you. I do not think we do enough as scholars and professionals to take up the question, to whom do things belong? Answering that question is not an easy one in American cities. As the path-breaking work of critical race studies scholar and professor here at UCLA Law, Kesu Park, has shown, in the US, the liquidity of property, which we see in the House of Gunther story, was set into motion by settler colonists and took shape in property forms that to this day protect the opacity of property ownership. In our research at the UCLA Luskin Institute on Inequality and Democracy, we therefore strive to situate the housing question in the political economy of racial capitalism. For example, in Who Profits from Crisis, we focus on what we call housing grabs, by which we mean the unregulated corporate acquisition of residential property. And we show how these have taken place at key conjunctures, such as in the aftermath of the subprime crisis and in neighborhoods in LA with high renter vulnerability, such as South Central Los Angeles. This also entails demystifying the ownership of property and by figuring out to whom things belong. By the way, I know Pete White couldn't join you today from the LA Community Action Network, but this research project started out as homework from Pete, as does quite a bit of our work. The work of Pamela Stevens, who's a doctoral candidate in urban planning here at UCLA and also researcher at the Institute, this map on Black population change shows what's at stake in the kinds of housing grabs that we study. The outcome is recursive dispossession manifested today in US metropolitan regions, not only as ghettoization, but in fact as peripheralization. In a searing analysis a few decades ago, Mike Davis had called the working class neighborhoods of LA a rent plantation. And in a brilliant MERP thesis, Alex Ferrer, who is now a doctoral student here in geography and also a researcher at the Institute, develops an elaborate analysis of LA as a rent plantation. Alex analyzes the flow of rent income and shows how neighborhoods such as South Central LA are a net exporter of housing value to not only other parts of Los Angeles, but in fact to other parts of the country. He built on the work of Black Studies scholar and UCLA urban planning alumnus Clyde Woods and argues in Woods' terms that this is a form of asset stripping from neighborhoods like South Central. So I'm asking you to think about this question. What is the right to housing on a rent plantation? For us at the Institute, it has meant making what our Associate Faculty Director, Hannah Appel, scholar of global finance capital, professor of anthropology here at UCLA, and organizer and co-founder of the Debt Collective, calls reparative public goods. What does it mean for us to think about housing as a reparative public good? With Alex Ferrer, Gary Blasey, public interest lawyers, organizers from the LA Tenants Union, she has built the Tenant Power Toolkit, which is a California-wide legal aid infrastructure for eviction defense, and most importantly, for gathering data on property ownership, and thus enabling tenant organizing that targets predatory and otherwise invisible landlords. Unsettling these systems of ownership and speculation is essential. And yet really difficult. And it's difficult not just because of the opacity of property ownership, it is difficult because we are all invested and implicated in them. So in 2023, the Institute convened 3 current and former UN Special Rapporteurs on Adequate Housing, including Leilani Farha, and you heard from Karen about Leilani, to discuss the right to housing. And each of them situated the housing question in what Raquel Rolnick calls the empire of finance. As we gathered in virtual space, that very same week, our university, the University of California, and this is my 26th year as a faculty member in the UC system, the University of California announced a $4 billion investment in the Blackstone Real Estate Investment Trust. Blackstone is, of course, the world's largest private equity firm. This was in addition to the $2 billion already invested in Blackstone via our UC retirement funds. Leilani Farha, who was part of our Right to Housing event, just a few years prior to that, as UN Special Rapporteur, in a scathing report, had pinpointed Blackstone as perhaps the world's most predatory actor in the financialization of housing. It is important to note that our university, the University of California, made this investment in Blackstone just as a historic labor strike by 48,000 academic workers, mainly about the rent-wage gap, was coming to an end. The terms of the investment, if you look it up, and I hope you will, are such that the University of California is bailing out Blackstone, while Blackstone turns even more aggressive in rent hikes and evictions to meet the guaranteed double-digit investment returns promised to the University of California. My second provocation this evening is titled, "All That Is Solid Melts into Air." The phrase, as some of you might know, comes from Marx, and it's also the title of an iconic book in urban studies by Marshall Berman that has been required reading for many of us. Now, it's commonplace to lament the shortage of housing in a city such as Los Angeles. While the House of Gunther story reminds us of the hoarding of vacant property in luxury housing markets, other segments of the housing market have scarcity. But I want to draw your attention this evening to a different kind of housing shortage, one where housing resources melt into air. This is not a story of austerity, but a story about how expansion becomes scarcity. And of course, the big, beautiful bill looms over us now, and we anticipate that that scarcity and precarity is only going to deepen. But for the past 5 years or so, there has in fact been an expansion of housing resources, including federal and state funds. During the COVID-19 pandemic, housing justice movements demanded that vacant hotels here in LA be turned into housing, and they were, in a program called Project Room Key and another called Project Home Key. Also during the pandemic, housing justice movements demanded and won an eviction, a national eviction moratorium. They demanded and won an expansion of federal housing vouchers. Nearly 6,000 emergency housing vouchers made their way to LA County, one of the largest expansions of housing vouchers we've seen in many, many, many decades. Community organizations like LA Can made sure that thousands of unhoused people signed up for them. Where are these housing resources? All that is solid melts into air. In our ongoing research on the spatial governance of mass homelessness, and we've been so fortunate to have RAIN as a key part of that research, we find that despite being run at the cost of millions, such programs never yielded housing. Project Room Key became a program not of housing, even interim housing, but of carceral isolation and containment. prisons and morgues, is what folks living in these hotels started calling them. Project Homekey motel conversions remain stalled, and in yet another LA city scandal, it turns out that there was tremendous corruption and the siphoning of funds from Project Homekey. Emergency housing vouchers remain elusive, mysteriously melted into air. Our analysis of LASA data, and LASA is the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, and I should say that we're the only researchers in LA with access to fully identified LASA data, as well as our ethnographic research, shows that when unhoused people are able to secure housing vouchers and a housing match, a process that requires incredible advocacy and endurance, those vouchers turn out to be not permanent ones, which is what they should be, but rather what are called time-limited subsidies, like rapid rehousing, temporary rental subsidies that end abruptly, returning people to homelessness. So Carla Orendorff, who I mentioned before, tells me regularly, be careful. We will get everything we fight for, but when we get it, it will all be shit. All that is solid melts into air. Air is expensive. I know it's hard to read this, but our unhoused comrades at the Etna Street encampment that we have been journeying with for a while, as part of the mayor's Inside Safe operation, were all taken to the motel that is, it's not really row 6, but numbered as 6, the Palm Tree Inn. The financial costs of the system of temporary housing, temporized housing, is evident in this latest data that the city had to provide for the ongoing LA Alliance legal battles. And it gives us a glimpse of how much money is being spent, right, on this temporized housing. And for the Palm Tree Motel, I know this is hard to read, we are looking at numbers, right, of close to $42,000 a year per bed, but in most cases, we are looking at numbers of close to, actually the Palm Tree Inn is $82,000, right? Over $82,000 per bed per year. Our mayor calls this housing the homeless. Homeless folks call it storaging the homeless, right? That is the language most often used. And I want you to think about the amount of investment being made in storaging the homeless, in the case of the Palm Tree Inn, in a bed bug infested motel that is much less safe than living on the streets. And yet we find, I know this is, the point of view of this is not for you to be able to read this. It is to recognize the ways in which unhoused folks, in this case, someone whom we have called Rosie Cardenas, repeatedly enroll in these programs that they know are storaging the homeless. Because it is not that homeless people are shelter resistant, it is that the system is housing resistant. This is one of many trajectories that we as a research team have been able to create by stitching together different elements of the LASA data. LASA cannot see in this data what we see. And we then create a narrative form that allows us to understand how one person, in this case Rosie, has only 42 years old, has in fact enrolled in countless shelter and housing programs over and over and over and over again in journeys of endurance and affective anticipation. What you see here is not a housing trajectory. What you see here is what we've come to call displaceability by design. We've generated these trajectories for people we know well, like Rosie, and people we don't. Rosie, after 2 years of waiting at the Palm Tree Inn, now has a voucher and a housing placement as of a month ago. It is a rapid rehousing voucher, and a housing navigator tells her that she has 1 year on it. Having studied the systems of displaceability for the past few years, one whose logic is that of spatial churn and carceral supervision, I have grown skeptical of the right to housing. Indeed, I would argue that the right to housing has been weaponized, especially in the governance of mass homelessness. While we should all be very concerned about Trump's proclamation of homeless camps, let us be clear that in liberal cities such as Los Angeles and liberal states such as California, we do not need the fascists to engineer such solutions. The liberals will suffice. Even before the decisive Supreme Court ruling striking down the protections of Martin versus Boise, California politicians were wielding housing as a tool to manage the poor. It is thus that Mayor Garcetti declared the militarized eviction of the Echo Park Lake encampment, which many of us came to study, as one of the most successful housing transitions in the history of Los Angeles. Our work found that of the nearly 200 people evicted, only 4 were housed at the end of a one-year period, 2 of whom we in fact housed ourselves. During his time as mayor of Sacramento, Darrell Steinberg sought to codify what he called a first-in-the-nation right to housing and obligation to accept. He said homeless people should have a legal right to shelter and a legal obligation to utilize it, meaning carceral punishment if they fail to utilize the right to housing. It's important to note how he redefined housing. The definition of housing, he said, would include permanent dwellings such as a house, apartment, hotel room, temporary shelters, tents, RVs, trailers, and tiny homes in city-approved locations. In a provocative book, housing justice scholar Michele Lancione and founder of the Radical Housing Journal asked, what if the solution to homelessness is not home? If so, how do we think beyond the right to housing? How do we move from the right to housing to what Karen already mentioned in her introduction this evening, to spatial justice, a framework that has an important tradition here in LA, in the work of Ed Soja, in the work of Dana Cuff, and most of all in our housing justice movements, from LA Can to Unión de Vecinos, to Reclaiming Our Homes, to the San Fernando Valley Homeless Union. They are not demanding to be inside safe. They are demanding a reparation of racial regimes of property. They are demanding a restitution of the surplus value that generates wealth. They are demanding a divestment from the systems of harm. So let me end my talk this evening by remembering one of my movement comrades, Benito Flores, who comes from one of our key movements here in LA, Reclaiming Our Homes in El Sereno, a movement that has sought to restitute the empty, expropriated homes in the Latino working class neighborhood of El Sereno, hoarded for decades by Caltrans for a freeway project that was never built and protected at the cost of millions of dollars by CHP. Benito, whom you see in the foreground here, when accused of the illegal occupation of a vacant house, would counter that he is lawfully homeless, that he had been made homeless by the laws and policies that keep wages low and rent high. He was reclaiming not just a house stolen by the state, but the surplus value that his labor as a metal welder had generated for decades. We recently mourned the loss of Benito Flores. Facing eviction, he built a treehouse on his reclaimed property with the intent of barricading himself there when the sheriff's deputies arrived. The sanctuary turned deadly, and one morning, Benito fell to his death from the tree. Benito's death was social murder. In the mural honoring him on the walls of the East Side Cafe, a cultural resistance space inspired by the Zapatista movement, Benito Flores has an opossum by his feet. Movement artists who created the mural explain that the opossum has the unusual ability to mimic death in order to evade predators. In a world of deathscapes, from death by design borders to death-dealing evictions, how do we learn not just to mourn death or mimic it, but to live? Rosie Cardenas, whose unhousing trajectory I shared with you earlier, is part of a book that I have the great honor to put together called We Live in Public, a book by movement and encampment scholars, many of them who resided on Etna Street. She's called her chapter Living Beyond Eviction. I'd like us to think about how we can live beyond eviction and even live beyond housing. Thank you.
The overhead. Yeah. So how am I? Where's the song? Correct. This one. Yeah. I'm not sure I can recover that quickly. To keep going. I think architecture from folks like us whose every day is about the physical act of building, live in a world of optimism. And these reminders of the things that are working against it are very compelling and hard to forget. Nevertheless, I think architects who build have to keep on building. Us stopping doesn't help the problem. And here I am with this great opportunity to complain in public, for which I'm grateful. But before I do that, I'm going to show you two case studies of projects we have done. The first is supportive housing, and I sort of subtitled it Urban Retreat. Even if you're walking down the street and it's a busy city, the idea of getting away and getting a reprieve from the busyness of the street is a pleasure and makes you feel better. If you're living on a street that's really tough, it's even more important. This is floor housing, and what you're seeing, which we designed and helped get built for what was then the Skid Row Housing Trust. What you're seeing in front of that building as it was nearing completion is folks living on the street. It's a hard thing to get your head around. There's really a disconnect between the supply that's there, the ability to get into the housing. This was taken fairly early on. I don't know exactly what's happened with the re-ownership. Oh, sorry. I don't know who owns Skid Row Housing Trust property anymore, but I have gone by. There are 99 units here. It's a LEED Platinum building. It's 5/1 concrete podium. For those of you not in the architecture business, it's 5 stories of wood construction over 1 story of concrete construction. And that's what the building code allows us to do. And that's the most economical sort of level to do it. It was designed sort of as a green space, which is rare on Skid Row, provided within the terrace courtyard and amplified by street trees at the starting, was our starting point to promote quality of life for residents. Absurdly, getting those 4 street trees planted on the sidewalk took months of effort with the LA Bureau of Street Services. They're the organization responsible for the urban forest. Seems odd, doesn't it? Who would have preferred us not to plant any trees. City planning struggled with the courtyard as an idea. The city's plan favored storefront street activation in an era where retail space is hard to fill anywhere, let alone on the edge of Skid Row. Planners demanded more about modulation, which added cost but enhanced the facade. I don't think that's a trivial improvement, actually. I think the idea that that buildings for people who have limited means should look frugal is a sort of a stupid place to start. Massing and orientation. the orientation is really great from an environmental point of view because it limits the amount of openings facing west. And it allows for the breezes to move through. The front gate could be a small boutique hotel. Why not? We don't think of people as wanting less just because they have less. We can't think that way. There's passive eyes on the street from the management office where that man in a white t-shirt is walking past. And as you come through the gate, you enter a very quiet courtyard. To your right is, actually, I get left and right mixed up, so just whichever direction it was. There are social services available for people in the building and for people in the neighborhood. Circulation is an opportunity as well as a necessity and can be organized to do more than just get you from A to B. It can promote exercise by how it's placed, an opportunity for informal social interaction as you can wave at someone you can see at a distance, and can augment passive security. The stair takes you up to the second landscape level and the social core of the project. The housing here is studio apartments, and each of the studio apartments has large windows. Daylight improves a sense of well-being, as we all know. So what you're doing in this game of budget, which is important, is trying to work out where do you spend your money that has the most impact. Lighting of personal space is a big one. Economy needs to interlock with benefit. A bridge is an economic substitute for an enclosed exit stair. What I mean is it costs roughly the same and provides a better social connection. Unfortunately, housing providers don't like them as much because they're harder in the long term to maintain than an interior stair. This is a full disclosure presentation. Annoys the hell out of me. Sunshades provide environmental benefit and a sense of craft and ornament. The idea of craft is not trivial. It carries a subliminal message of care. The second project is a whole different game, and actually this will raise your mood. It's a community hub around a transit station. It's around 190 units, 187 to be exact. It's LEED Gold. That's a whole other discussion we have to have at some point. It's 5 stories of wood construction over 1 story of concrete construction, and it has subterranean parking. It's about twice as big as the project I just showed you, and has a much more demanding agenda for its site and the community. It's got 50% permanent supportive housing and 50% low-income family housing. And I forgot even where the button is. There we go. As you can see, it's kind of around the Santa Monica, Vermont metro station, and LA City College is just down the hill. It's also located in East Hollywood, which is a low-income, ethnically diverse, and one of the densest neighborhoods in the city. Just a little background on this, on the station. It opened in 1999, and the portal, the elliptical portal, marked the entry down to the platform. It was set in a vacant pink granite paved plaza where retail was not permitted. I don't know what people were thinking, but why they thought that would work is beyond me. It's not an architect's problem. This is actually a programming idea about how you make public space feel comfortable and usable. Transit and development nexus is what we believe happens, and I've read a lot of essays on gentrification caused by public transportation being included. That did not happen here. It did not stimulate development. And the metro didn't have enough land together, even if they had wanted to be able to pull off a project that would have been able to catalyze that kind of development. That's 1999. 2017 begins to see the opportunity for a joint development. When Little Tokyo Service Center approached Metro, Little Tokyo Service Center are a housing developer based downtown, not for profit, with the idea of combining their properties with Metro-owned land that to develop an ambitious vision for a community hub. So what you're seeing is in the orange is the metro-owned land. Outside the green line is the plaza. And then you see the two pieces of property that LATSC owned. Site consolidation was complete when we joined the project in 2019. It's 2025, we're 1999, 2025, takes a while, huh? And they're almost done. Residents, yeah. We've been trying to get photos of this building for about 8 months, right? Okay, sorry. But they haven't finished the plaza, and the retail is not in place. Design was framed by cost, codes, and obsolete overlay specific plans and ordinances, which is another complaint, okay. But in truth, like all of our projects and all of our peers who are doing really good work, it was designed around a bigger idea. In this case, the idea of a community hub. So let me sort of explain how this worked. Creating a hub started by establishing a visual continuity between housing and plaza open space to create a supersized front porch, borrowing from the architecture biennale kind of concept of how you relate between where people live and the public space. The strategy amplifies the impact of green space, adds benefit of connectivity, activity, and eyes on the street, which is secure, which is a good strategy for security for the residents and the public. There's a secure residential area above, that's the green stuff, which includes play areas, laundries, picnic areas, and community rooms distributed over 3 levels with stairs and bridges strategically located to encourage social interaction as well as informal exercise. Ground floor retail, the plaza, and the perimeter planning, as I said, is not complete. Hope is that seating will spill out over the underutilized open space, but no one's really sure. What we've got to do is have a will within Metro to help this happen and maintain it. And they're not in the business of public space. They're in the business of ridership. So in fairness to their mission, it's really a difficult thing to work out who is responsible for making public spaces work well. Because little Tokyo can't pay for keeping up a public space. They've got housing to provide. I need to lighten the mood, so here's some things. Usually I'm sort of the happy person, but I was very moved by Ananya's talk, and the times are really getting to me, as I'm sure they're getting to others. There's 24,000 square foot of retail space on the ground floor, and the entry to the housing is on the, boy, the pink doesn't even show up. That's really disappointing. And the resident entry, you can see on the left here, off the plaza. On the second floor, there are 57 studios. I don't need to go into that kind of stuff. But as you can see, there's gardens, shared laundries, and more activity space. And I put in a little photo there so you could understand the organization at the upper levels. The design of SMV, as we call it, Santa Monica, Vermont, although the station is called Vermont Santa Monica, it just doesn't flow as well, does it? Offers a response to a provocation that James Rojas, a Chicano urbanist, and his partner John Kemp have made. They mourn the loss of places like the Grand Burrito, which was demolished to allow for the housing. You lose something when you gain something. It's tough. And the neighborhood porch. They rightly wanted to know why new high-density housing is so uniform, insular, and bland. I'm paraphrasing them. So if they're out there, tell me what exactly I should have said. Where is the personality, diversity, and community in what is being built? SMV certainly took a stab at it. And it was designed with the objective, which is scaled up or amped up idea of a porch and the use of vernacular color. And if anyone's, LA never mind. I'm not going to go into the color thing because everyone has strange views about it. So starting at the front gate, let me walk you through. So where you're looking from is if the portal is behind the viewers, and the entry to the housing is on the right in the yellow door. Yellow gate. And it's a little messy. And there's a front yard with mailboxes, which would take another half an hour if I was to go through with you what it took to get the mailboxes approved there by the Postal Service. It involved Adam Schiff. It involved letters to other senators. They said that it was too far from the curb, even though they deliver much further for single-family houses. Going the extra bit was too much for the Postal Service people. Yeah, I'm getting angry again. I'm angry. So the view from the second floor shows how carving the open space back at this level expands the read of plaza open space. So these are the kind of things that architects do that are sleight of hands. So what looks like, a straight edge does not give you that idea of generosity to the space below. Second floor activity space there's a forecourt to the second floor activity room, which you can see there. And then behind that activity room, you're seeing some of the accessway in the landscape of the housing. You're kind of in the geode of the project. It's a stucco building with a kind of a shiny metal center. Second floor activity space with kids play space above, which you can see up there, but I didn't take a photograph of it yet. If we go back downstairs, you're looking at the side yard. A side yard is not a throwaway. A side yard is an opportunity. And here it's landscaped, and it's where activity spaces, you can see on the right, open out. So the community can have events and learning opportunities and just hang out. And now looking back towards the gate, you can see the entry, and I think that's the end of our tour, unless I back out. Oh, I have more. Look at that. You could get to see it from the corner. And you can see it as we move along Santa Monica Boulevard. It's a really happy building. One of the most happy moments for me was we went there as people were moving in, and the smiles on people's faces wasn't just because they had housing. I want to claim the credit for our office. What we designed as a team made people feel happy. And that's part of our job. So, complaining. See what makes me happy? So the stuff, I sort of focus on the stuff that undercuts what architects do when they build. There's a lot of people here who use their architecture background to do other things, to focus more on strategy or other things as well. All architecture, but our focus and the work of our office is about building buildings. What I worry about is losing sight of quality of life for residents in the scramble to produce units fast, cheaply, and at scale. Doesn't mean we don't need to do that, but if we do that first without setting up an objective for quality of life, we've missed half the opportunity. Stupid rules, like the Postal Service. I have some other ones. Yeah, okay. I better start on that one. That impact design, budget, and speed, and over-reliance on the formulaic in building and unit design. So the optimist in me says, there are opportunities for better outcomes. Lead with quality of life, challenge codes and interpretations, something we enjoy doing. But we are getting an increasingly risk-averse building climate because of the cost of construction and the certainty that the people we build for, not just the residents, but the organizations that make the housing possible, feel very at risk. And then the third one is as an antidote to the formulaic, we have to keep making opportunities for experimentation and exploration, which is what cityLAB does to a certain extent. But we were talking today about the opportunity maybe for pilot programs that could happen throughout the housing production industry. And then calls to action to accelerate change. So as architects who build, that doesn't preclude the need for us to do things that will make things happen faster. And many people in our office have done this kind of stuff, sat on boards and commissions and advocated for housing, and realized that it takes a lot of perseverance to make this gig work. Happy to talk to you more about it, and thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you. I'll ask. Oh, good. Thank you, lights person. So now that we have the lights up, I'll invite our phenomenal speakers and Dana to please join me at the long table, and we'll have a couple of questions amongst ourselves, and then please get ready to ask your own questions, audience.
Really provocative and counterpoint kind of lectures we just heard. It's difficult to square the first with the second. And I think those of us in architecture,
If I had
like,
a dog, I could have done.
yeah, I mean, like Julie, I mean, when you get Roy, it's like a tsunami,
Yeah.
really, of a kind of shocking facts. And I wonder, Ananya, if I could ask you, this seems really unfair, and you can just tell me it is. If you could build a bridge in a way to what Julie's talking about.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. I think that would be really helpful to all of us.
Yes, I need this.
So I was,
I know you might have something to say.
okay, now I've really messed up the mics.
And now we need to both pointed at you.
All right. So I was so very grateful to be able to listen to Julie's analysis, but also Julie's thoughtful presentation of these projects and what we might not otherwise see in them. And I will say two immediate thoughts, well, a few. One, if you notice the timeline, what is it, 1995 to 2025, and we're still not done. That is also the timeline that goes hand in hand with an unhousing trajectory like Rosie Cardina's, right? So you take that unhousing trajectory, people enrolling over and over and over again in programs with the anticipation of housing, right? Held in a state of waiting. And then you think about what it takes, right? To get these projects built. And those two go hand in hand, right? The second piece of this is, of course, LA Metro. So one of the encampments where we've been working, the Etna Street encampment, which is now fully enclosed and folks have been displaced to the Palm Tree Motel, etc. That encampment, which was in existence in Van Nuys since 2017, is really been on the sidewalk bordering the metro station there, right? And with folks using some of the parking lots to store their belongings. In 2023, I taught a year-long capstone course in our MERP program, focused on the Etna encampment. We called it a lab for liberatory projects. It was a spatial justice class that brought together urban planning grad students doing their capstone project with Etna residents. So a community collaborative class. And so many of my students focused on the fact that LA Metro was the landowner, right? The story, my closing story, is about Caltrans as a landowner. And what does it mean then to think about public agencies that hold land, but do not think of themselves as landowners, and as Julie pointed out, do not know what to even do with how that land might be public space? Metro spent much of its time in Etna deploying its police forces, right, to police its vacant parking lots. And in fact, our students tried to engage with LA Metro, and they had all sorts of interesting plans for what it would mean to take that vacant LA Metro land and do something else with it. They've been calling it a universal access center, and that work continues as a collaboration between planning students, social welfare students, and medical students here at UCLA, who have an all-power-free clinic in that part of Van Nuys. So I could go on and on, but those are some that immediately come to mind.
Well,
In defense of MTA, because they have a program going at the moment which is using underutilized land and putting it out for development for housing. That was a big step, and I think it's a meaningful step. So we've got two things happening. It's kind of it's like they don't know what to do with the land that they have in terms of their control in public space, and they have a pretty ambitious goal of using underutilized land to provide housing.
And I think it's our job to help them use that land.
It is our job, yeah. I'm wondering what you go ahead. No, go.
So one of your provocations, Julie, was that there's an overuse of the formulaic. And I certainly recall from the beginning of my career working in affordable housing, the margins are so small, it's hard to make a living as an architect. And that's kind of the only way you do it sometimes, right? If you can just repeat what you did in the last project, at least you're spending less time. So what should we know about how you set up your practice, or how you're able to combat that kind of, the way that work is done out of necessity a lot of the time? Yeah, we need both. It's weird, but
That's really weird.
Yeah, I know.
I think because we set ourselves up as a practice who was more interested in incremental change of a standard system, that we're not interested in doing just another one. We can't test an idea that moves things forward. The project isn't that appealing. Now, sometimes you do projects because you learn different things about it. About the system, which you can use to move things forward. So not every project has a visible change in it, but it's a learning change in it. I think it's very hard to keep the palette fresh. I think there's also the idea that if you have a lot of experience, you will do it better. But actually, experience is often as a thin disguise for habit, which is safe for the owner and safe for the architect. I don't know, you just got to stay energized. If you come to an event like this and you hear what the problem is, you think, well, I got to do more because these people deserve more. If you associate with the people that you're building with rather than seeing it as them and us, I've always thought that, they're the same. They could be a Beverly Hills millionaire, or they could be somebody who has nothing that's coming from the street. They're people. And our job as architects is to make places that's beautiful for everyone. So why are they any less of an interesting client, one or the other? So I don't have a moral high ground about it, but I do have a thing that if we keep our eye on the quality of the experience, we will stop doing what is routine and think more about what we can do to improve the system each time. I sound so idealistic. I must be 25 again. I don't know what's going on.
I also think, though, what you say about sometimes the unconventional isn't maybe even something that's visible, but something that you gain from. To me, one of the connections between your analysis and close reading of what's going on in the space of unhoused lives. And Julie's work of trying to build the housing that would be providing for them is that we have to know the kind of things that you talk about, Ananya, or we don't even understand where we fit in that larger process. And if we don't see the recursiveness of that cycle of, a voucher that's removed, that becomes temporary, that's pretending to be permanent, we don't have a criticism ready for the tiny homes movement, right? I mean, that we could see those as part of what I think you called like a weaponization of housing on behalf of the state rather than the people who are living there. And that is something that I think comes up for many of us as we talk with our friends who aren't in building or planning. Right? So it's better than nothing. Actually, it is nothing. I mean, I think that's what you're showing us.
But do you know it's nothing before you try it?
Well, okay.
I don't mean
yes.
as a resident, but as a strategy, because when you look at it theoretically, it sounds like a really good idea.
I think though, I mean, I don't know, Anya, you answer that. Not me. Yeah, I mean, I have an answer, but I think yours is better.
No, so I think, when we first, and Rain was a part of this project, when we first started studying the eviction from Echo Park Lake.
Yeah.
Right. And this promise this was made that everyone evicted would be housed within a year. We held hope in that. We didn't undertake that research project because we were like, oh my God, this is all going to be crap. Right. And we not only held hope in it, we worked fiercely, we organized, we advocated, right? Even before there was a Project Room Key, along with Gary Blasey and a bunch of other folks, I wrote a report called Hotel California, laying out a blueprint, if you will, almost, for how hotels and motels could be converted into housing. So that second provocation was about how things we have fought for, right, become something else. And become something else because in this case, I've really come to believe that the intent is not to house people, but to storage them, right? And if our intent is to get rid of visible homeless encampments and to storage the homeless, right, then we're not going to be building housing. And part of this has to do with there's been so much criticism of the price point of permanent supportive housing.
Oh, this bull,
right?
Yeah.
But you look at the data we just got. This was an appendix to the LA Alliance latest report, right? And we're like, what are these numbers? If I take you to the Palm Tree Motel, you're going to look at that place and think about how it is $82,000 per person per bed, right? If you think about the food contracts, folks get meals like we said, it's rotting, awful foods that they're getting, and yet millions of public dollars are being spent on that while you are being told, no, you cannot, in fact, do this particular design because it's too expensive, right? So I think that we've got to, in some ways, I would argue that we've got to completely rethink, even abolish the homeless industrial complex because its intent is not to house people, and think about what housing means and how we build it, right? The irony is that when I say that, it sounds a lot like our current occupant of the White House, right? And so we're at a very difficult moment when these critiques are being weaponized in the way that I would argue the right to housing has been weaponized, where it's like, yeah, you have the right to housing. We're going to offer you one night in a shelter and you dare say no, and we will handcuff you and jail you, right? So I think that is a key piece. But I also want to say that my first provocation was about the developer houses and the hoarding of wealth and the vacant houses that, well, that have perhaps not been designed but have been built. And there is a whole nother flurry of speculative building, right, that so many of our professions are implicated in. And it is also our job, I would argue, to short circuit that to intervene in that, right? To think about what spatial justice means, not just in relation to those who are the most housing precarious, but also in relation to those who hold tremendous wealth. And that, to me, is a challenge, right, in planning and architecture.
You know, we really see this happening right now in the burn areas. And ironically, in Altadena, what we're watching is the kind of Blackstone problem of outside developers swooping in with an emphasis on private homes rather than trying to think of what the collective solution would be. And in the Palisades, there's a kind of, developer opening the doors to his own neighborhood, welcoming development in spite of the fact that they can't have any multifamily housing. So we're watching in real time a kind of architectural symphony of development occurring on land that has been made vulnerable, and the people who own that property even more vulnerable. And it's where I think we can start to see how architecture can intervene. And I would say one of the answers is like just taking the smallest example, Julie, where you're worrying about where you pick up your mail. Like if you don't start worrying about those small things in a building, you lose it. It escapes, it melts into air. And in that sense, those small changes are in some ways where you can build back in something like the architecture that supports community and that cares. And it doesn't have to be huge. I mean, it's great if it's huge, but most of us don't get the opportunity for that. But I think the key is to recognize that even something that small, which may not seem like architecture, is where a sense of belonging can happen. And that's really what we want to build in whenever we can, to the work we're doing when it's about housing.
Perhaps we can open to the audience. And okay, I see a hand just shot up. Wait for the mic, please.
Okay, this is not gonna sound proper, but the question I have is around, I think it's statute 79 in California, the one that.
SB 79.
SB 79, one that allows the state of California to override when a city or a local area blocks a particular project, as long as it's near a transit hub. And I grew up in California, I grew up in LA. I'm totally with you on the developer boarding thing. And I have seen developers plan buildings where they take advantage of zoning rules to favor low income housing, and they completely take advantage of that to build up and then rent out those spaces to family members or other people that don't actually need the housing. And I'm wondering to what extent or what would need to happen that, I don't know if it's activists or people in the state of California can do to augment that. I mean, if cities are being forced to comply with the state overriding blocking and plan, is there anything else that we put on the ballot that potentially can force something around low income?
I'm just looking at the time. Let's take one more question and maybe answer both of them together. There was another hand up here. Yeah. Okay.
Ananya and Karen, I asked you this question because you obviously studied this problem around the world. The right to housing is something we talk a lot about. Now, it's the example and the primary focus of your lecture is really about Los Angeles. But is there somewhere where the right to housing is being, provided or at least evaluated or considered in a way that really gives those who are homeless a chance? Is there somewhere where this is being done fairly or in some more equitable way than what we see in Los Angeles?
She's nodding.
You want to take the SB 79 first?
I'm going to SB 79. SB 79, okay. The problem is, the way we solve problems is from one extreme to the other. We were talking earlier today about how the available development potential of LA dropped precipitously in the early 80s. And it was because communities, probably all the same kind of people in the room here, said, we're building too much, we're building too much. And they dropped it all, so everything was below 3:1 FAR. Right? Then we get further along, and all of a sudden it's very difficult to build enough housing. And you go to community meetings, and if you're presenting at a community meeting, you may hear later from friends, it's like they're never going to talk to you again. How could you possibly support putting new housing on a commercial boulevard that's going to be 6 stories high? It's like, I mean, come on, guys. So to a certain extent, this is what cities were doing. They didn't mean to be bad, but we had compressed what was possible so much, and we had given so much voice to one group without them ever having to lose anything. So what happened is the state came in and with a sledgehammer, because I'm not 100% sure I agree with the uniformity of the density for the different situations they're talking about, said, here's a solution. And to a certain extent, they had to do it. I just wish that each time that we do these changes, we think about more of a medium rather than an exaggerated response.
I'll share not a comprehensive answer to the larger question, but an important anecdote. And then check out our future essays in Untapped too. No, and do check I will emphasize that the lectures are all online, and we had an amazing in Brazil. We also had a phenomenal human rights and housing rights lawyer as part of the discussion. So it was in Portuguese, but you can get the captions. Anyways, I'll tell an anecdote. So one of the people I mentioned was part of our Brazil program is Carmen Silva, the head of the Downtown Homelessness Movement, or MSTC, in São Paulo. And one of the aspects of the right to housing is location, which is to say that you could have a beautiful house, an amazing, culturally adequate, accessible, habitable, affordable house, but if it's not near your job, near your kid's school, whatever, you don't want to live there. And she talked about specifically, she could have been housed. She had a place to live, but it was in the outskirts. And she would rather, and she did, she was homeless in the city center because it was so important to her to be there. And then asking about laws. So the right to housing has existed in Brazil in some ways since 1988 after the dictatorship, and then more strongly since 2000. There are other laws there that make it so that buildings are meant to be put to their highest use, for instance. So MSTC has a series of occupations, and I've never seen anything closer to utopia in my life. Amazing. So there was we saw some examples of empty buildings. There, the laws are in their favor. So there was an empty, mid-rise building right downtown, turned into occupation 9 de Julio, and you go in, there's grounds, and it's so beautiful, you guys, it's amazing. There's productive farming, it's political, so they're telling their whole story through, it's didactic, you'll see it. Every Sunday, there's 2 communal kitchens on the ground floor. Every Sunday, there's a community meal. This is not free housing, they have a very intricate system of self-organization. There's on-site social services. This is led by formerly homeless women of color. So this is one example where, with the laws behind them, they're creating, some version of utopia in a small way. Of course, massive issues in Brazil, but small glimmers of hope and small, amazing ways of life for the people who get to live there. So I don't know, we're basically at time. What shall we close?
Anyone got a happy question?
It's a really happy wait. Right?
Okay.
That was pretty happy.
Okay, so we're feeling happy, and maybe we'll be even happier if we go through that portal to have some food. Please hang out with us. There's amazing people in the audience, some old friends. Thanks for coming. And with massive, massive gratitude to Ananya and Julie for joining it. They've never met before. We're so honored to have them on the same panel, and to Dana for being my partner in crime of all of this, and our hosts and my assistant. So thank you so much. Join us for food.